Thank you. Thank you very much. Great to be here. How many of you got a chance to get your two-step on last night? I haven't even mastered the one-step, so I'm working my way up. But you know, the fun thing about that dance is it's simple. So let's talk for a minute about simplicity. I'm not talking about the kind of simplicity that might lead you to exit your nice home in the burbs and move to a tiny home, although that has some appeal. I'm talking about the kind of things where we all understand that a simple answer is always better than a more complex answer if we can get it, right? And simple is always best as long as it actually solves the problem. Let me give you one of my favorite illustrations of sort of over-engineering for the complexity of the problem. When I was a very wee lad in the 60s, there was a big space race going on between the US and Russia. And what was clear was that they needed to have the ability to write in space to capture notes of what was happening and all that. So NASA, in its brilliance, set out to develop an incredibly competent pen that could write in space. Now, at that time, normal pens required two things, atmospheric pressure and gravity, both of which are not readily available in space. So after millions of dollars of investment, NASA developed a pen that could write in space. Amazing. The Russians, silly Russians, not very competent, clearly just used one of these. Maybe sometimes we overthink the problem. Somebody needed to write in space, all we needed was a pencil. So this idea of having a simple solution to a problem, we have to first understand the complexity of the problem, but always understand that the nuance we can't miss is we have to actually solve the problem with whatever we're doing. And if we develop a simple solution that doesn't actually solve the problem, that's not really helpful, is it? That can actually lead to unfortunate, even sometimes disastrous consequences when a solution fails because it really didn't address the problem. Let's shift to another industry that's a little closer to home for all of us. Let's talk about how understanding the problem was a big factor in the evolution of the mobile phone industry. So in the late 90s, some of you were around, some of you weren't. Most of us were, I think, in this room. The simple act of making a phone call was kind of supposedly solved, right? Well, drop calls, anyone? Last week? Maybe not. But the idea of making a phone call was kind of solved, but there was this new communications challenge that emerged in the 90s called texting, right? And if you had one of the phones that a lot of us had in that era, a Nokia phone, it was really fun because you had to use the little 10-key keypad and remember which letters were with which key and try to get the word to come out right and didn't have backspace and autocorrect and all that junk. So it was kind of a fail for Nokia. Nokia kind of missed that wave, and kind of it was the beginning of the end for Nokia. Now there was another device manufacturer at that time who had already solved that problem because they had a keyboard. Anybody remember one of these? BlackBerry. By the way, what I didn't recall when I found my old BlackBerry, I was apparently into bedazzling at the same time. Or this might not be my BlackBerry. One could infer, I don't know. But it was kind of tricky to figure out whether that was just going to be the winner, because if you needed to make calls and text, clearly BlackBerry had it nailed. They had a phone, they could do email, and they could text. Why wouldn't they be the winner? But in the meantime, those rascals over in Cupertino had a different plan, didn't they? They were thinking about how to combine things like a music player from something we used to carry around called an iPod. And they thought, wouldn't it be cool to have a camera in your pocket at all times? I didn't think I needed a camera in my pocket at all times, did you? But maybe we did. And why carry around a Palm Pilot? Anybody remember one of those that could do your calendar and your tasks? That could be in the phone. Ultimately, really, it was a small computer in our pocket. That's what they delivered. They made over, complete makeover of the traditional phone, right? And what Apple had realized that calling and texting were table stakes. They were commodity-like at that point. Like if anybody could do that, they could be a competitor in that industry. But if they could reimagine what could be combined and unified into a single device to deliver tremendous productivity and enjoyment, they might be the winner. And really, that's what they did. Matter of fact, I don't know how far back they thought about having this thing be our wallet. I remember when I first thought about that, I'm like, no way am I going to use my phone for my wallet. I can't remember the last time I didn't use Apple Pay if it was available, right? So they clearly had this vision for unifying a set of capabilities and rethinking what could be done. Now let's bring it a little closer to home for our industry, right? Identity governance, which at the time we didn't even call that, was originally about provisioning. That was the first use case in the early 2000s. Some of you knew the company I and others were part of called Waveset. We kind of had this idea like, let's make it easier to just get users access to what they need. And in another part of the identity industry, some smart folks had said, this signing into web apps, circa Netegrity, and signing into cloud apps, circa Okta, that's kind of a pain too. Why don't we make that simpler? So those two original use cases, kind of like calling and texting, were kind of provisioning and single sign-on. And that was good, right? We should make those things easy and more usable, right? They became those original use cases, and I can tell you this with confidence, like unlike Grady, who was not around for the Greek Wars, I was around when this happened. I was there. So today what you see happening is some newer vendors entering our space saying, hey, we're gonna show up and we're gonna address identity security or identity governance. And they're showing up with SSO and provisioning, for the most part. That's great. Those are great use cases. They're still valid, right? But I think it's time for us to reimagine the scope of the problem. And here at SailPoint, we're trying to do what we've always done, which is to listen to all of you carefully, understand what you see evolving in your needs, what kind of things you would like to see brought together to help you do your job and support your companies better, and to really, again, like Apple did for the phone, the device, reimagine the whole problem and think about it in a new way, and make sure we have a truly comprehensive, unified solution that goes far beyond those simple use cases. In our minds, we have to answer some pretty difficult questions, like how can you actually protect the data in your application once you've granted access for a valid reason to some user? How do you enable and yet secure access to this exploding level of identities and data in your enterprise? How do you validate and certify that, in fact, at any point in time, the right identities, people or systems, have access to what they need and no more and no less? How do you protect that access against it, that nobody or no thing can come in and completely rip out the data of an application or a server and take it away? And to Matt's point yesterday with his magic math machine, how do we do this at the enterprise scale and complexity that all of you are facing today? We believe it's fundamentally impossible now without the aid of intelligence and automation. And of course, today that largely means using AI, right? The kind of the new standard for intelligence. And just like Apple fundamentally embedded a lot of deep technology into the phone, so users that are less educated about phones like me, I don't know how that stuff works in my phone. It just does, right? I show up and it quickly, powerfully, pretty seamlessly get to what I need. Most of the time, when the darn phone call works, it makes my life enjoyable and more productive. Well, back to AI and us, SailPoint began leaning in on AI kind of long before it was cool. About 7 years ago, we started investing in AI, thinking where could we start to use this emerging technology? And 4 years ago, we launched our first products built on AI. So we've been thinking about how to apply AI for a long time. And it's not magic, and you'll hear more about this in a lot of our breakouts, but there are ways we believe AI can dramatically streamline and automate a lot of the things we've been wrestling with in this industry for a long time, fundamentally making us less reliant on humans to do so much of this work. The other big goal of AI is absolutely in line with our theme for the conference this year, which is acceleration. How do we use this technology to accelerate what we're doing to help you solve your problems faster and more effectively? Because the faster we deliver new value to you, we believe the better and faster you can serve your organizations with identity security. So let's talk for a few minutes about how we're trying to accelerate identity security today. And what does all this mean in the challenges we're facing as the industry is so rapidly evolving? What are we doing at SailPoint to not only kind of rethink that whole comprehensive solution, but how does that help you deliver the value you need to in your organization? Back to the history lesson, I've been around this industry sort of since we started calling it an identity industry. And I can say unequivocally that the problem we solve is complex. It is quite complex. That doesn't mean the solution needs to be quite so complex, and we've got some work to do there. The important nuance, though, is that as we solve for the complexity, we can't lighten up on the technology we need to address the scope of the problem. We have to ensure that the solution we develop is effective, but as simple as possible. Remember our pencil, our simple technology for a very simple problem. Whereas maybe another metaphor I'll pull out for just a second is a wristwatch, right? A wristwatch appears to have a very simple UI, as we say, but there's a lot of complexity in an old style wristwatch going on, right? To get the time exactly right. So that's maybe a little closer to the metaphor for what we're doing. We need to present a simple interface for the problems that we're solving in the enterprise, but there's a fair amount of complexity that's going to be hidden behind the scenes to do that effectively for enterprise identity. Now, you probably have picked up on the fact that we're kind of at an interesting inflection point in this industry. There's been a lot of distraction as many, many vendors are entering the space. Everybody seems to have a new flavor of how they're going to solve identity. Everybody wants a piece of the action, as they say. Why is that? Well, again, having been around the game for a while, I think what's become increasingly apparent to all of us who are identity professionals, the security professionals that have a broader purview, even the CIOs and executives in organizations, is that identity is a critical lens for security that we haven't really focused on historically, right? The other lenses we've looked through historically at security, network security, data security, device or endpoint security, they're still valid, but they've clearly proven insufficient to fully address the needs of our enterprises. That identity lens, in fact, has not only been recognized as maybe the most critical lens, our understanding of it has broadened and deepened pretty dramatically in the last few years. So some of you were around for our IPO about 6 years ago, literally next month. And at the time, we were trying to explain to the market who we were and what we did. So we sort of articulated this pretty simple two-part question to say, look, the question we're trying to answer for enterprises is who should have access to what, and what do they currently actually have access to, and is that in line? Because if our desired state matches our actual state, we're not only just compliant with regulatory and audit issues, we're actually probably pretty secure. Well, the non-human aspects of who are obviously dramatically shifting, right? We believe they're probably going to exponentially outstrip the people identities that we're managing over time. When we started in this industry 20 years ago, we were talking about employees. Who in the organization can access information? Quite a while back, that certainly expanded to other forms of humans. And as most of you know, we made an investment earlier this year to bring in some very focused technology to work on what we call the non-employee risk management problem, the contractors and business partners and supply chain, value chains. But now what we're really seeing in a lot of your enterprises is that non-human element of identities, intelligent devices, software bots, robotic processes. Those are the things we think are going to get incredibly complex and incredibly difficult to manage in the coming years. And another thought that's become pretty clear to us, especially the OGs in the industry, whether we acknowledged it or not, in the early parts of this industry, we were actually focused on protecting data as accessed through an application. So most of the realm of provisioning and lifecycle and all of that was really focused on who can have access to your application, and therefore your data should be protected, right? But what else has shifted in our industry? The what. If the who was the identities, the what is the data. And the what has also dramatically exploded, right? We've got now data getting created and shared and modified, not just in applications for the most part, but in SharePoint and Dropbox and Snowflake. And that explosion is exponential as well. So we used to think about employees accessing applications. Now we're like lots of kinds of identities, accessing lots of kinds of data. And again, we believe the only way we're going to solve that at scale in your type of an organization is with AI. We're just not going to do this with spreadsheets anymore. And if somebody's telling you they can, they're just lying to you. So let's talk about what's happening in this space as people are recognizing this and seeing what's happening. Again, as I said a minute ago, there is a lot of noise in the space right now. There's a lot of confusion about who's playing in identity. What are they doing? How does it compare to others? There's a concept you've no doubt heard out there called IGA Lite. Well, let's talk about that one for a minute. With all due respect to the IGA Lite concept, it's kind of that simplification of the core technology. Let's just do kind of the basic things, but try to do them simply and easily. Here's our primary issue with that concept in the industry. The IGA Lite purports to be a simple solution, but I think it only applies to a simple problem. And that's why it might, in fact, be a reasonable solution for relatively small businesses. 500-size companies, 500-person-sized companies. When you get to enterprise-scale organizations, which we typically define as a few thousand and up, and many of you are many multiples of that, right? We have to have a solution that actually addresses the complexity of the problem. It should be as simple as possible, But we can't strip out capabilities in the name of simplicity when they aren't going to actually address the scope of the problem in the enterprise. In other words, IGA Lite is kind of a simple solution for a simple problem. Unfortunately, enterprise identity is not a simple problem. It's a very complex problem. And the Lite approach tends to kind of box you in. It doesn't really give you room to grow. It might be a good way to start in a small part of your enterprise, but where are you going to grow with that solution? Here at SailPoint, we have been and always will be focused on that enterprise class problem and ensuring that we're addressing the needs you have today and where you're going to go over time, the real requirements of enterprise identity. Another kind of value that comes along supposedly with these light solutions is that you can move quickly. Our belief is you can't slap ASAP solution on an enterprise identity security problem unless you flip that word. Maybe it shouldn't be as simple as possible, or as soon as possible. It should be absolutely as simple as possible, right? We need a solution that's as simple as possible, delivered as soon as possible, but it has to address the complexity of the problem. Like NASA, it may not need to be a complex solution, but for what we do, it's probably more like a phone or a watch. There's a fair amount of complexity behind the scenes that we need to simplify for our users. So let's talk about what we think is required for the next generation of enterprise security. It's got to be lean. That's one of the words you're going to hear from us more and more. What we need to do is not disrupt your business, kind of just what you need as you need it, which largely involves getting more of the humans out of the process. How do we use intelligence to drive much more automation with intelligence to reflect policy so identity can become increasingly self-driving for the parts of it that really don't require a lot of human intervention? And therefore, can't we just kind of, by policy, get people what they need? And when something changes, by policy, take away what's no longer appropriate? That requires a deep amount of intelligence and automation, but it's definitely within our purview. But it's not just about being lean, it's also about being unified. Grady talked about this yesterday. And what we see happening in the market is that there is this move toward convergence, right? Focusing on traditional swim lanes, bringing together access SSO, governance, and privilege. We don't happen to think that just rolling up the traditional swim lanes of this industry is the best way to solve your problem. We have a different flavor of convergence that we think is the right answer, and it's this idea of unifying a set of capabilities deeply embedded in a platform. The modern next-gen approach to identity has to be comprehensive, but it's got to be simple and lean and unified. It's got to cover the entire landscape of who, as I said a minute ago, every identity you care about. It's got to cover all the what, all the data you care about and wherever it is. We're going to have to address privilege as an aspect of who, not like a separate siloed problem. The privileged identity industry, PAM, as a market space, kind of developed independently, right? That's fine. It worked well for those very specific problems of root Unix access and DBAs, et cetera. We think now, though, privilege is going to be much more of a nuanced, granular thing that we have to spin up and spin down and escalate and de-escalate depending on the context of what's happening in the industry, all within the context of your entire identity ecosystem, not in a separate silo. Treating it as a separate thing, we think, has created another set of risk profiles that we're concerned about. Ensuring we understand and manage risk across the spectrum will be part of the purview of identity security as we move forward. But we've also got to unify another aspect of this industry, and that's this separation of applications and data and how we've been managing it. We have to extend the policies and controls we apply to identities to the data, not just the applications. Data is what's running your enterprise today. It's what fuels your business decisions. It's got to be protected, and in many cases, it's got to be kept private. It's what the attackers are after, as we all know, right? But as identity security professionals, we can't, I think, kind of abdicate, as we sometimes have, that thought of, well, I don't manage the data stuff, I manage this part of the application environment. There's a data team that's worrying about the data. We've got to integrate these things if we're going to truly provide a secure environment for our enterprise. So this is how we are beginning to and will continue to be looking at the future of identity. What we're going to be focused on is, thank you, not about being light, not about being traditionally converging applications, right? It's about delivering integrated, comprehensive solutions that are simple and lean, but robust enough to really solve the problem for the complexities at the enterprise. We'll have to address every type of enterprise identity, far beyond employees and contractors. We're going to have to address every kind of data, wherever it lives, whoever seems to have control over it, so we understand how to protect it. And we've got to manage risk across that spectrum in a much more real-time fashion than we have historically. And we think the only way to do that is to build it on a unified platform, which is what Grady launched yesterday with Atlas, Grady and Matt. So, to ensure we continue to meet your needs, my commitment, our commitment, is that we will keep on listening. That's a hallmark of our approach here at SailPoint. We don't huddle up in our back offices and say, we know what you need, here it is. We try to get out there all the time to listen carefully to what you're telling us you need, how to bring the things together that will make your life better and your solution more effective. And that's our commitment to you, that we will bring this solution to you over the coming years to integrate all the identities, manage all the data through a unified platform. I hope you'll continue to join us on this journey together. We're grateful you've joined us here at Navigate. I hope you don't just go home and say, well, I don't know what I learned about identity, but I ate some barbecue and learned to do two-step. But we hope you've had a chance to learn a lot from both the SailPoint and our partner professionals here, and most importantly, your peers. When I'm out there prior to Navigate, sometimes talking to folks about coming, I'm like, look, you should maybe come hear us. There's somebody reinforcing my phone metaphor, thank you. You should probably come listen to us. You should really come and interact with your peers. That's the real value of coming together at Navigate. But we believe with SailPoint at the center of your identity ecosystem, you can truly secure your enterprise through this important lens of identity, enabling you to drive the acceleration we're talking about this week. We want to continue to earn the right to be your strategic partner in identity, and we hope you'll join us on that journey. Thanks.